I'm Richard Taylor from the Philosophy Department at Marquette University and visiting professor at the Catholic University of Leuven. And together with my colleague, Professor Andrea Robilio at the Catholic University of Leuven, we present to you this course on Thomas Aquinas on the nature and attainment of happiness in fall 2014. This is a collaboration of our two universities. And this is our fourth collaboration of this sort. This is class number 12. This is a video for class number 12, which is concerned with Aquinas on ultimate happiness in the Summa theologiae, prima secundae, questions 1 through 3. This is video 12b, and it involves considering ultimate human happiness in the context of theology in question 3. The ongoing issue in this video and the previous one, 12a, is the consideration of just precisely how theological the discussion in Summa theologiae, prima secundae, questions 1 through 3, in fact is. But let's proceed with what we have on this question 3 for now. First of all, an overview. Question 3 is focused on just what is happiness, and it consists of 8 articles. As I did with questions 1 and 2, here I want to begin with consideration of the last article of question 8, which, like the others, consists in, like the other two questions, this last article, question 3, the consideration of the last article of question, 3. So, as I did with questions 1 and 2, here I want to begin with consideration of the last article of question 3, which likewise consists in a culmination of the entire question. Let's look at some important parts of that text. The title of Article 8 is whether man's happiness consists in the vision of the divine essence. From our earlier studies, we know that ultimate human happiness will be reasoned by Aquinas to consist in just that, the vision of the divine essence. Let's now look carefully at the entire response to Article 8. Quote, I answer that final and perfect happiness can consist in nothing else than the vision of the divine essence. To make this clear, 2 points must be observed. First, that man is not perfectly happy so long as something remains for him to desire and seek. So this has to be something that is attained, and when a human being has it, no longer desires and seeks anything else but that very thing and the actual possession of it. He goes on, secondly, that the perfection of any power is determined by the nature of its object. Now, he explains now, the object of the intellect is what a thing is, that is, the essence of a thing, according to De Anima 3:6. Wherefore, the intellect attains perfection insofar as it knows the thing, the essence of the thing. You see how he's setting up the reasoning here then. The full attainment of something and the full perfection of the power of intellect is in grasping the essence or the what of a thing. And in this case, it's going to be grasping the whatness or the essence of God. And only that will fulfill a human being sufficiently. This is where his argument is going. He continues, if therefore an intellect knows the essence of some effect, whereby it is not possible to know the essence of the cause, that is, to know of the cause what it is, that intellect cannot be said to reach that cause simply, although it may be able to gather from the effect the knowledge of what the cause is. Let's pause for a minute here then. So the very knowing of some lower effect does not reveal sufficiently and fully the nature of the essence of the cause. And what the intellect seeks to know is the essence of the cause, because it's after the most perfect object of its knowing, and the most fulfilling object is that essence. Let's carry on. Consequently, when man knows an effect and knows that it has a cause, there naturally remains in the man the desire to know about the cause, what it is. Put another way, demonstration quia regarding the divine essence is not sufficient in revealing what the very essence of God is. That would be a demonstration propter quid, And what the intellect seeks out in fulfillment here is to know the very essence of God, not that God exists, but what God is. He goes on, and this desire is one of wonder and causes inquiry, as is stated at the beginning of metaphysics. For instance, if a man, knowing the eclipse of the sun, consider that it must be due to some cause, and know not what the cause is, he wonders about it, and from wondering proceeds to inquire. Nor does this inquiry cease until he arrive at a knowledge of the essence of the cause. So the whole setup in the discussion here, in this response, is that we seek out for our complete perfection, intellectual perfection, and ultimate fulfillment, we must know the essence of the cause. He continues, this is still the response, the last part of the response. If, therefore, the human intellect, knowing the essence of some created effect, knows no more of God than that he is, that is, a demonstration quia, the perfection of that intellect does not yet reach simply the first cause. But there remains in it the natural desire to seek the cause, that is, to seek the essence of the cause, because intellect as such is made to apprehend essences. Aquinas goes on then, wherefore it is not yet perfectly happy. Consequently, for perfect happiness, the intellect needs to reach the very essence of the first cause, and thus it will have its perfection through union with God as that object, in which alone man's happiness consists, as stated earlier. So Aquinas is very, very clear on exactly what is the ultimate fulfillment in happiness here, and that it has to be intellectual, and that it is not knowing that God exists, but knowing the very essence of God. Now this is rather interesting because, as we'll see later on, it appears that for Averroes is a very different doctrine. And the doctrine of Averroes does say that human fulfillment and the ultimate form of worship of God is knowing God and God's creation. But for Averroes, it is not a knowledge of the very essence of God as such, but a knowledge of God through the effects. And that constitutes ultimate happiness to the extent that human beings are able to have happiness in their perishable state of existence. Recall then, for Aquinas, human beings, of course, are not perishable, and their ultimate fulfillment is connected with their desire, their nature as intellect, and their desire to see and know God in God's fullness. But the very nature of intellect, the nature of the human being, according to Averroes in his account, is very, very different, and much, much less than what Aquinas sets forth in his own understanding. Let's continue. So let's now return to Articles 1 through 7. Article 7 has the title, Whether Happiness is Something Uncreated. And for consideration of response then, of Aquinas, let's first take a look at Aristotle De Anima, Book 2, Chapter 4, at 415b 1-2. Quoting Aristotle then, the phrase, for the sake of which, is ambiguous. It may mean either the end, to achieve which, or the being in whose interest the act is done. Close quote. And that's the translation of J. Smith in the Complete Works of Aristotle, edited by Barnes. Phrased in another way, that is my own phrasing here, the notion of end includes both that which is aimed at and the perfection of the being in the attainment of the end of the action. For example, John aims his efforts at perfect health and realizes in himself some perfection of health by doing so. So in the achievement of the end, some benefit is enjoyed by John. In the case of seeking happiness, God is the end sought to be attained, and the attainment is the perfection and completion of the human being in attaining God. To reach this conclusion, Aquinas uses the Aristotelian notion of a twofold end. Of one, what is desired, and two, what is possessed in the fulfillment of having the end, that is, of achieving the end. Now let's look at this in the text of Aquinas. He says, quote, "In the first sense, then, man's last end is the uncreated good, namely God, who alone, by his infinite goodness, can perfectly satisfy man's will. But in the second way, man's last end is something created, existing in him, and this is nothing else than the attainment or enjoyment of the last end. Now the last end is called happiness. If therefore we consider man's happiness in its cause or object, then it is something uncreated, namely God. But if we consider it as to the very essence of happiness, then it is something created. That is, something created in the human being. It comes about in the human being, this kind of happiness." Article 2 asks whether happiness is an operation. Put another way to put this is to ask whether it is an activity. And this is Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. For Aquinas, happiness is not something consequent upon an activity, as is pleasure, nor is it a disposition or habit. Rather, it is an operation or activity of the soul in accord with virtue, in particular, or more precisely, with intellectual virtue, in contemplation, theoretical contemplation, since human beings are in their fullest nature as rational beings when they are exercising intellect. And this is something that comes to be in a human being as a fulfillment of actuality in the activity of knowing God. So God is the end to be achieved, and the happiness to be attained is also an activity in the human being, in the knowing human being. Aquinas writes, quote, "So insofar as man's happiness is something created existing in him, we must needs say that it is an operation or activity. For happiness is man's supreme perfection. Now each thing is perfect insofar as it is actual, since potentiality without act is imperfect. Consequently, happiness must consist in man's last act. But it is evident that operation is the last act of the operator, wherefore the philosopher calls it second act." He references De Anima, Book 2 here. "Because that which has a form can be potentially operating, just as he who knows is potentially considering. Hence it is that in other things, too, each one is said to be for its operation. Therefore, man's happiness must of necessity consist in an operation." Close quote. That is, happiness is an activity or an operation, not a receptivity, not a disposition, not a habit as such, but rather it's an actuality of intellect in apprehending God. Ultimate happiness, that is. Let's take a close look at Aquinas' reply to objection 4, because this elucidates things even further. Since happiness, he writes, quote, "Since happiness signifies some final perfection, according as various things capable of happiness can attain to various degrees of perfection, so must there be various meanings applied to happiness. For in God there is happiness essentially, since his very being is his operation, whereby he enjoys no other than himself. In the happy angels, the final perfection is in respect of some operation by which they are united to the uncreated good, God. And this operation of theirs is one only and everlasting. But in men, according to their present state of life, the final perfection is in respect of an operation whereby man is united to God. This is with regard to the final perfection. But this operation neither can be continual, nor, consequently, is it one only, because operation is multiplied by being discontinued. Let's go back to that for a moment, though. And that is that here in this life, the operation cannot be continuous. And so we cannot realize, human beings cannot realize in a complete way the perfect final perfection. And he continues here. Let's take a look then at Aquinas' reply to objection 4, continued. This is the continuation of that passage. He goes on. And for this reason, in the present state of life, perfect happiness cannot be attained by man. Wherefore the philosopher, in placing man's happiness in this life, in Book 10 of the Ethics, says that it is imperfect, and after a long discussion concludes, quote, we call men happy, but only as men, close quote. But God has promised us perfect happiness when we shall be as the angels in heaven, close quote, from Matthew. Clearly enough, then, the ultimate perfection in operation cannot be had in the present life in the body, since, as Aristotle notes, human beings tire and cannot be carrying out theoretical contemplation continuously without stop. And Aquinas agrees in this and finds that it can only be had in another life. Aristotle, however, himself does not directly mention another life, of course, as we've seen already. Article 3 is entitled Whether Happiness is an Operation of the Sensitive Part or of the Intellective Part Only. Here, after indicating that happiness can belong to something, 1, essentially, 2, antecedently, 3, consequently, Aquinas rejects the notion of it being an operation of the sensitive part essentially, since the conjoining with God is immaterial, not sensual in its own right. Still, Aquinas does allow for it to be antecedently involved, since intellect naturally requires the senses for its operation, and for it to be consequently involved because of the resurrection. Still, quote, the operation whereby man's mind is united to God will not depend on the senses. Close quote. Article 4 is entitled Whether, if happiness is in the intellective part, it is an operation of the intellect or of the will. Close quote. In his response, Aquinas distinguishes the essence of happiness and the proper accident of it, which is the delight connected to it. Its essence consists in the attainment of the end in actuality, which is not an act of will, but an act of intellect. Will may direct a human being toward the end, but the end is the activity and the actuality of intellectual apprehension of God. Aquinas then writes, quote, For at first we desire to attain an intelligible end. We attain it through its being made present to us by an act of the intellect. And then the delighted will rests in the end when attained. Pardon me. So therefore, the essence of happiness consists in an act of the intellect. But the delight that results from happiness pertains to the will. Note also his reply to objection 4. Quote, Love ranks above knowledge in moving, but knowledge precedes love in attaining. For naught is loved save what is known, as Augustine says in De Trinitate. Consequently, we first attain an intelligible end by an act of the intellect, just as we first attain a sensible end by an act of the sense. Now, I have in mind here also that this might be interesting to think about with regard to the discussion of love of self and the role that love of self plays in the realization of knowledge in ourselves, something that we have discussed earlier in the class. But let's proceed. Article 5 is entitled Whether Happiness is an Operation of the Speculative or of the Practical Intellect. I comment here that I generally prefer theoretical to speculative in the translation of the relevant term here. But at any rate, let's continue. His response is that it is of the speculative or theoretical intellect for 3 reasons. 1, it has to be an operation of the highest human power in relation to the highest object. This is an operation of intellect in the activity of realizing itself as theoretical intellect in the contemplation of divine things. the operation which is, quote, most proper to man and most delightful to him, close quote. 2. This intellectual contemplation is for its own sake, while the practical is for the sake of action. And 3. By the speculative or theoretical intellect, the human intellect shares something with God and the angels, with a likeness in happiness. Aquinas concludes the response, writing the following, quote, therefore the last and perfect happiness which we await in the life to come consists entirely in contemplation. And of course this is theoretical contemplation. But imperfect happiness, such as can be had here, and here is in the world here, consists first and principally in an operation of the practical intellect directing human actions and passions, as is stated in Aristotle's Ethics, Book 10. Also note the following as well from this, from the reply to objection 1, but the likeness of the, quote, but the likeness of the speculative intellect to God is one of union and information, or informing, which is a much greater likeness, that is much greater likeness than the likeness found in the practical intellect and its actions. And from reply to objection 2, Aquinas states, the practical intellect is ordained to a good which is outside of it, but the speculative or theoretical intellect has good within it, namely the contemplation of truth. And of course then this is a distinction between something that is sought that is outside, and the speculative intellect as intellectual understanding is a realization or a fulfillment of the human being, and fulfillment of the power of knowing. And also from reply to objection 3, he writes, but since man's last end is something outside of him, to wit God, to whom we reach out by an operation of the speculative intellect, therefore man's happiness consists in an operation of the speculative intellect rather than of the practical intellect. So it's pretty clear for Aquinas then that this speculative or theoretical intellect is what must be fulfilled in its operation, and that operation is to apprehend God. Article 6 is entitled, Whether Happiness Consists in the Consideration of Speculative Sciences. Since we've discussed Averroes and the confusion in the Latin tradition regarding his teachings on knowing and ultimate happiness, we should look carefully at the response of Aquinas. But from our earlier work relating to Averroes, please keep in mind the interpretation of Averroes which I provided earlier, since, in my view, the real doctrine of Averroes is that happiness consists in the consideration of God and all the beings of the universe through the tools available to human beings in speculative or theoretical sciences. Recall the quotation of Averroes regarding the Sharia, or religious law of the philosophers, the law that dictated that philosophers were to find the highest kind of worship of God in the study of the science of metaphysics, which considers all being that owes its reality and fulfillment and completion to as being, and unity as well, to God as final cause of all. So for Averroes, the Sharia of the philosopher is to study God's creation and God as much as possible, to the extent that human intellect is able to do so. Perishable human intellect, that is able to do so. And the response continues. The response from Article 6 is as follows, As stated above, man's happiness is twofold, one perfect and the other imperfect. And by perfect happiness we are to understand that which attains to the true notion of happiness. And by imperfect happiness, that which does not attain thereto, but partakes of some particular likeness of happiness. Thus perfect prudence is in man, with whom is the idea of things to be done, while imperfect prudence is in certain irrational animals, who are possessed of certain particular instincts in respect of works similar to works of prudence. He continues, This is Article 6. Accordingly, perfect happiness cannot consist essentially in the consideration of speculative sciences. To prove this, we must observe that the consideration of a speculative science does not extend beyond the scope of the principles of that science, since the entire science is virtually contained in its principles. Now, the first principles of speculative sciences are received through the senses, as the philosopher clearly states in the beginning of Metaphysics 1 and at the end of Postulationalytics 2:15. Wherefore, the entire consideration of speculative sciences cannot extend farther than the knowledge of sensibles can lead. Now, man's final happiness, which is his final perfection, cannot consist in the knowledge of sensibles, or anything derived just from sensibles, is what he has in mind. For a thing is not perfected by something lower except insofar as the lower partakes of something higher. And let's continue with this account. So continuing with the response and completing the response of Aquinas to Article 6. Quote, now it is evident that the form of a stone or of any sensible is lower than man. Consequently, the intellect is not perfected by the form of the stone as such, but inasmuch as it partakes of a certain likeness to that which is above the human intellect, namely the intelligible light, or something of this kind. Now, whatever is by something else reduced to that which is of itself. Therefore, man's final perfection must needs be through knowledge of something above the human intellect. But it has been shown that man cannot acquire through sensibles the knowledge of separate substances, which are above the human intellect. Consequently, it follows that man's happiness cannot consist in the consideration of speculative sciences. However, just as in sensible forms there is a participation of the higher substances, so the consideration of speculative sciences is a certain participation of true and perfect happiness. So that's the ultimate fulfillment and perfection of a human being in the speculative sciences, certainly not in things that are sensible. Article 7 is entitled Whether Happiness Consists in the Knowledge of Separate Substances, namely angels. But of course he just dealt with this. We've encountered this issue before, also in the Summa contra Gentiles, so it's not surprising that Aquinas holds that perfect happiness is not in the partial perfection of the intellect through the consideration of truths of lower things. Perfect fulfillment is only in contemplation of the being and essence of God alone. Still, he allows that there is some imperfect happiness in the contemplation of angels. Now, we make our own reditio, or return, to Article 8, which was discussed at the beginning of this video. Complete fulfillment and perfection in knowing the ultimate object of human desire, namely God, is not a knowing that God exists, demonstration quia, but rather is a grasping or apprehending of God in his essence, which reveals something of just what God is in himself. It reveals to the human intellect something of the very essence of God and the nature of divine activities. And the human intellect is made to apprehend the essences of things. So this is the fulfillment of the activity of the intellect with the highest activity of intellect, together with the highest object of intellect. In seeing the very essence of God, perfect happiness is attained in fulfillment with the active knowing of the divine essence in a complete return. So this concludes video 12b on Summa Theologiae, Prima Secundae, question 3.